The dog smelled the grief before the truck even stopped. He stood at the edge of the porch with his ears forward and his nose working the cold morning air. And when the dark blue pickup rolled to a stop at the end of the gravel drive, he did not bark. He only watched. Nadia Polimas, 71 years old, had learned in the 3 years since she adopted Cinder to trust that kind of watching. The bark meant stranger. The silence meant something else entirely. She came to the door wrapped in a cardigan, the color of old bark, her white hair pulled back in the way she had worn it since her husband died. She did not open the screen. The man climbing out of the truck was broad through the shoulders and moved the way men move when they have spent years carrying weight they cannot put down. His face was weathered, deeply lined at the corners of his eyes, and when he looked up the drive toward the house, there was something in his expression that had nothing to do with directions or lost mail. He had driven a long way. She could see that in the way he stood for a moment beside his truck, with his hand on the door, not moving, as though he was giving himself one more second to decide something. Cinder stepped off the porch and walked down the gravel path toward him, without any signal from her. If this story stays with you, take a moment to subscribe and turn on the bell so you never miss one like it. The man's name was Garrett Mace. He was 39 years old, 6 feet and 2 inches of assembled discipline, with close-cropped dark hair going gray at the temples and a jaw that looked as though it had been set against a great many things and never quite relaxed. He had spent 11 years as an infantry marine, the last 4 of them as a staff sergeant, with a unit that had rotated through 2 deployments and one that neither deployment nor the official record adequately described. He had been out of the Corps for 2 years and had not settled anywhere yet, which was evident in the truck, which carried everything he owned. He had not planned to be here. He had planned to drive from Billings to Spokane to see a man named Gill, who owed him a small debt and might have a job. The exit for Faro Junction was 40 miles before Spokane, and he had taken it almost before he made the decision, the way you sometimes do when a thing you have been avoiding finally runs out of road. He had known the town's name for 6 years, had known it the way you know the name of a place you have no particular reason to go. Danny had mentioned it often enough that the name had lodged somewhere and stayed, the way things stay when they arrive with weight attached to them. Faro Junction, Danny had said once, is the kind of town that teaches you what enough looks like. Garrett had not understood that then. He was not entirely sure he understood it now. The exit had been there, and the name had been there, and he had turned without deciding to turn, and then the decision was behind him, and the town was ahead. Cinder reached him before he started up the path. She was a large German shepherd, 82 pounds, with a sable coat that ran nearly black at the shoulders and lightened to tawny gold at her legs and chest. Her ears stood fully erect, 2 dark triangles that tracked everything. She had been a military working dog before she retired, and it showed in the way she moved, deliberate and grounded, her dark eyes reading him with a depth that felt almost rude. She pressed her nose against his left hand and held it there. Garrett looked down at her. His jaw loosened slightly. "She decides pretty quick," Nadia said from the doorway. "Yeah," he said. "I know the type." He came up the porch steps and told her his name and then told her what he had come to say, which was that he had served beside her son Danny for 3 years, and that he had not called, and that he was sorry for the amount of time that had passed, and that there were things he thought she probably deserved to hear from someone who had actually been there. Nadia Polimas looked at him for a long moment. She was a small woman with a serious face and eyes that were pale gray, the color of creek water in February. There was no softness that came from ignorance. There was only the softness that comes from having carried something heavy for a long time, and choosing, still, not to put it down. "You'd better come in," she said. Danny Polemos had joined the Marines at 19 with the same seriousness that ran through his mother's face, the kind that other recruits occasionally mistook for arrogance until they understood it was simply attention. He was not arrogant, he was present. Every task he was given, he gave to completely, and the men in his unit noticed. Garrett had met him during the first week of their second rotation, and had formed the opinion, quickly and without revision, that Danny Polemos was someone you wanted beside you in the dark. He had been a lance corporal when everything changed. 22 years old, 2 months from the end of his enlistment. Nadia set a kettle on the stove and put 2 mugs on the table. The kitchen was the kind that had fed a family for decades, worn smooth at the edges, practical in its arrangement, with a window above the sink that looked out over a bare winter garden and a fence line gone gray with age. Photographs were arranged along the wall above the telephone table. Danny at 16 in his baseball uniform, Danny at his boot camp graduation, Danny and 2 other young men in desert gear, squinting into flat, bright light somewhere that was not here. Cinder settled herself beside Garrett's chair without being invited. 6 years, Nadia said. She set a mug in front of him. Not an accusation, an accounting. 6 years, he said. He wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at the window. Outside, the sky was the color of old pewter, and a light wind was moving through the pine row at the back of the property. He had rehearsed this in the truck, through Montana and the panhandle of Idaho, rehearsed it in the flat, factual language he trusted. In the kitchen, with the photographs on the wall and Cinder leaning against his leg, and this woman waiting with her hands folded around her own mug, the rehearsal fell apart, and he was left with only what was true. He told her about the last week of the deployment, not the event itself, which was in the record and which she had been told about through official channels, and which Garrett had not been present for and therefore had no right to narrate. He told her about the weeks before it, the way Danny had been, the things Danny had said to him one night on a guard rotation when neither of them could sleep, about Faro Junction, and about his mother, and about the garden she kept, and about a particular Saturday morning from when he was 11 years old, when they had driven 2 hours each way to watch a minor league game, and it had rained through the 5th inning, and they had stayed until the last out, because she said, "You stay for what you came for." Nadia did not cry. She held her mug, and she listened, and once she closed her eyes for a moment, and her lips pressed together. When Garrett stopped talking, the kitchen was quiet except for the tick of the range cooling. "He talked about that game," she said finally. "He talked about it more than once." "I didn't know that." "No reason you would have," Garrett said. "He didn't say things like that to people directly. He just said them to me out there, because there was nobody else to say them to at 2 in the morning." She looked at the photographs on the wall. "He stopped calling about 8 months before," she said. "After the second rotation started, I called the family support line. They said it was normal, that the communication could be irregular. And then when it ended the way it ended, I kept thinking there was something I missed, some sign I should have seen, some call I should have made that I didn't make." Garrett set his mug down. "He was not pulling away from you," he said. "He was trying to protect you. That's a different thing. Some men do that. They go quiet because they don't want to carry the distance home." She was quiet for a while. "Did it help?" she said. "Keeping things out?" Garrett looked at Cinder. "I'm not the person to ask. He stayed for dinner because she asked him to, and because he had nowhere pressing to be, and because Cinder had moved from beside his chair to across his feet, and showed no interest in releasing him. Nadia made soup from a ham bone, and the last of the autumn's root vegetables, and the kitchen filled with steam and the smell of thyme. She talked about Danny as a child, the way parents talk about children who are no longer living, which is to say carefully, picking only the moments that hold light. His habit of reading the newspaper at 12 years old. The summer he restrung every fence post on their 2 acres without being asked, using only a book from the library and his own judgment. Garrett listened. He ate 2 bowls of soup. After dinner, she showed him the letters. She had kept them in a shoebox in the hall closet, every letter Danny had written during basic and infantry training, before the deployment started, and the letters gave way to occasional and then infrequent calls. There were 14 of them. They were written in Danny's hand, which was neat and small, and surprisingly even for someone who had grown up writing left-handed. He had picked up the habit from his father, she explained. Gerald Polimas had believed that writing something down made it more true, more permanent, less subject to the erosions of memory or misunderstanding. He had kept a log of every repair he made to the house, every project started and finished, every tool purchased, dated and noted in a composition book he kept on the workbench shelf. When Danny was 9, Gerald had given him a journal and told him to write down anything he did not want to lose. Nadia had not known, until she found the journals after Danny shipped out the first time, how much that habit had taken hold. There were 3 composition books filled over the years between 9 and 18, small observations and questions and records of ordinary days, written in the same neat hand that appeared in the letters. She had read them once after Danny died. She had not been able to read them again. Garrett read 3 of the letters. He was quiet for a long time after. "He wrote well," he said. "He read everything," Nadia said. "His father was the same way. Both of them quiet men who put things better on paper than they ever did out loud." She had not mentioned her husband till now. Garrett waited. "Gerald died 4 years ago," she said. "Heart? He was 67. She looked at the box of letters. Danny was already gone by then. I called the notification number they had given me, and they told me they had passed the information along. I don't know if it reached him. I don't know what he knew at the end." This was the thing she had been carrying. Garrett could hear the shape of it in how she said it. The particular flatness that comes from a question you have asked yourself every day for years and still cannot answer. He had not known about Gerald Polimas dying. He had been out of contact with Danny for several months by that point. The way units separate and lose their threads. There was nothing he could tell her that was certain. "I think he knew," he said. It was not a thing he could prove. It was the thing he believed based on who Danny was and how closely Danny tracked everything that mattered to him. She nodded once, slowly, and she did not press him on it. She accepted it in the way she had apparently learned to accept things, which was to take what was true enough and hold it carefully and not demand more than the world had available to give. It was past 9 o'clock. The wind had picked up outside and was moving through the pines with a low, continuous sound. "The motel in town closes its desk at 10, Nadia said. "But there is a room upstairs, Danny's room. I have kept it presentable." She paused. "You don't have to if you'd rather not." Garrett looked at Cinder, who was sitting beside the door to the hallway, watching him with an expression that was not quite patience and not quite insistence. "All right," he said. The room was plain and orderly. A single bed with a blue blanket, a wooden desk, a window that faced the pine row, and on the shelf above the desk, a baseball and a small stack of paperback novels, and a photograph of Danny and a boy who was probably a cousin, both of them holding up a fish that neither of them looked entirely confident about. The room smelled faintly of cedar and old paper. Garrett sat on the edge of the bed for a while in the dark before he lay down. He had told himself, driving through 6 states, that he was coming here to deliver information, the factual record of what Danny had said, so that the woman who raised him could know that she had been talked about and thought of and loved in the spare, functional way that young men in hard places allow themselves to love. He had told himself it was a single errand, a thing to be done and completed. He was not sure now that it was going to be as simple as that. Cinder had followed him upstairs and had stationed herself outside the door. He could hear the sound of her settling on the floor, the small shift and exhale. He lay in Danny's room in the dark and listened to the wind and did not sleep for a long time. In the morning, she made eggs and toast and strong coffee without asking him how he took it, and he drank 3 cups. "I want to show you something," Nadia said when the dishes were done. She took him out, through the back door and across the winter garden to the fence line, and through a gate he hadn't seen from the kitchen window. Beyond the fence was a narrow strip of land, maybe 1/3 of an acre, that ran along the back of the property before meeting a gravel lane. It was ragged with last year's grass, and at the far end, half obscured by a tangle of volunteer sumac, was the skeleton of a small outbuilding. Concrete pad, 4 posts, a partial roof of corrugated tin that had come loose on one side and was lifted at an angle. "Gerald started it," she said. "A workshop. He got as far as the frame and the roof before his back gave out, and then before his heart did. That was 7 years ago. It has been sitting like that since." Garrett stood looking at it. Cinder moved through the dead grass around the perimeter of the structure, nose to the ground, conducting her own inspection. "I've had 3 different people tell me they would finish it," Nadia said. "A neighbor's son, a man from my church, a handyman I found through the hardware store. Each of them took a look and said they'd come back and didn't." She said this without bitterness. She was simply recording what had happened. Garrett walked to the structure and put his hand on one of the posts. It was pressure-treated pine, solid, correctly anchored. Gerald had known what he was doing. The work that had been done was good. What remained was a matter of materials and time. "You want it finished," Garrett said. "I want it to exist," she said. "Gerald wanted a place to build things. I would like for the place to exist, even if nobody builds anything in it." Garrett looked at the loose tin on the roof. He looked at the corner where a crossbeam was missing. He walked the perimeter of the concrete pad and checked the anchors on each post and found them all secure. "Do you have lumber?" he said. "There is some in the garage. I don't know how much." "Hardware store in town?" "Renfrew's on 2nd. They know me." He did not say he would do it. He walked back through the gate and helped her carry the breakfast dishes, and then went out to his truck and opened the bed and looked at what tools he had. He had enough. He had more than enough, actually, because he had been collecting tools for 2 years with no particular project in mind, the way a man sometimes prepares for a life he has not yet decided to live. He drove into Faro Junction for materials. The town was small in the way that towns are small when they have been declining for 20 years. Storefronts with gaps between them, a diner with a hand-lettered sign, a post office that also sold fishing licenses. Renfrew's Hardware was a long, low building on 2nd that smelled of sawdust and machine oil and had been in business long enough that the floor was worn to a particular smoothness in the paths between the shelves. The man behind the counter was in his late 60s, thick through the middle, with large hands and a deliberate way of speaking. His name was Frank Renfrew, which Garrett learned from the faded sign behind the register, and he had the quality of a man who had watched a great many things come and go and had developed no particular urgency about any of them. "Nadia send you?" he said. "I'm working on a project at her place." Frank looked at him for a moment. "She's been waiting a long time for somebody to finish that workshop," he said. "Yes, sir," Garrett said. "She has." Frank walked him to the lumber aisle and helped him sort through the framing stock. He did not ask unnecessary questions. He knew what a workshop frame needed, and he knew where Garrett was in the process based on what he was buying, and at one point he suggested a different bracket than the one Garrett had reached for, a heavier gauge, and was right. At the register, he said, "You a veteran?" "Marine Corps," Garrett said. Frank nodded once. "Gerald served," he said. "Army, early 70s. Didn't talk about it much." He ran the items through. "He was a good man. She's had a hard stretch." Garrett paid and did not say anything to that. The tribute to Gerald felt like a thing to receive rather than respond to. On the way back to the truck, a woman coming out of the post office glanced at the Palimas address on the receipt Frank had written out for delivery confirmation. She stopped. "You working at Nadia's place?" she said. She was in her mid-50s, a quilted vest, a practical face. "Yes," Garrett said. "Good," she said. "She needs someone paying attention to that property. That company has been sniffing around for months." She went into the post office without explaining further. He loaded what he needed into the truck bed and drove back. Cinder met him at the tailgate. He worked through the morning and into the early afternoon. The framing was straightforward, the kind of work that requires attention rather than inspiration, and Garrett gave it his full attention the way he gave everything. Nadia brought him coffee at 10 and did not hover. She went inside, and he could hear through the back window the faint sound of the radio she kept on the kitchen counter. At noon, she brought lunch out on a tray, a sandwich and a cup of soup, and set it on the concrete pad near where he was working. "You don't have to do that," he said. "You don't have to be here either," she said. And yet... He ate while she sat on the back steps, and Cinder moved between them at intervals, checking. The sun had come out, thin and white, and lay across the yard at a low winter angle that gave everything long shadows. "Did you know Gerald?" she asked. "No, I only knew Danny." She nodded. "Gerald would have liked you," she said. "He appreciated people who just did things." After lunch, he worked until the light started going. He had the new crossbeams in, and the roof section resecured, and the secondary framing started. It was good work. He could feel the difference between this and everything he had been doing for 2 years, which was mostly moving. He stayed a second night without being asked. On the third morning, he was working on the side wall framing when he heard a vehicle on the gravel lane behind the property. A white SUV, newer, with the word Vantage on the door panel. It slowed as it passed, and through the gap in the sumac he could see the driver, a man in his 40s in a pale button-down shirt, looking at the workshop as he went by. He did not stop. Cinder had heard it before Garrett had. She stood at the edge of the lane with her ears fully erect and her body perfectly still, tracking the SUV until it disappeared around the bend. She did not like it. That afternoon, Nadia mentioned, with the careful offhandedness of someone raising a subject they have been sitting with for a while, that she had received a letter 2 weeks ago from a property management company called Vantage Holdings. The letter was politely worded and ran to 2 pages. The substance of it was that Vantage Holdings had recently acquired the surrounding parcels and was interested in consolidating the corridor. They wanted to buy her property, The offer was described in the letter as fair market value, but the number given, which was below anything the property would have drawn 3 years ago, suggested that fair market value had been arrived at by a process Nadia had not been asked to participate in. She had not responded to the letter. She was 71 years old and had lived in this house for 43 years and had no intention of going anywhere. "Is this the first letter?" Garrett said. She went to a kitchen drawer and produced 3. The first was 8 months old. The second was 4 months old. The third was 2 weeks old. Each was politely worded. The offers had not increased. If anything, the language had become more formal in a way that felt, to Garrett, like a door closing on negotiation and opening on something else. He read all 3 letters twice. "What's in the surrounding parcels?" he said. "The Hendersons' land to the east went to bank sale 2 years ago. I heard Vantage bought it. The Alcott parcel to the north, same thing, about 18 months back. There used to be 4 families in this corridor. Now it's just me." Garrett set the letters on the table. He looked out the window at the finished side wall of the workshop. "What do they want with a corridor of small rural properties?" he said. It was not really a question directed at her. It was the beginning of a process. She said there was a rumor about a distribution facility, a regional logistics company that wanted flat land with gravel road access and enough distance from town to avoid zoning complications. He went back to work after dinner, but his mind was on the letters. He had dealt with enough situations in his career to know the difference between an offer and a campaign. What Vantage was running was a campaign. The SUV on the lane was part of it. After Nadia had gone to bed, he sat at the kitchen table with a notepad and wrote down what he knew and what he didn't know, which was a habit from his years of service that had never left him. He listed the property boundaries as best he understood them, the timing of the letters, the adjacent parcels, the name of the company. He drew a rough map of the corridor from memory, marking each parcel with the year Nadia had said it changed hands. The pattern was clear once you drew it. East parcel sold to bank, acquired by Vantage. North parcel, same sequence. The acquisitions moved inward from both sides. This parcel was the center. He looked up Vantage Holdings on his phone. It was registered in Delaware. The listed agent was a law firm in Spokane. The website had photographs of industrial facilities and language about logistics solutions. There were no names attached to the company in any of the publicly available records, which was not unusual and was also not accidental. So he searched the company name alongside the names of the other 2 counties Francis had mentioned. He found a brief item in a regional business publication from 14 months ago noting that Vantage Holdings had secured conditional approval for a distribution facility in Clearwater County, pending final parcel assembly. A follow-up piece 6 months later noted the project had broken ground. He read both pieces twice. He went to the county assessor's site and pulled the parcel data for the corridor. The property boundaries confirmed what Nadia had told him. There was a large, flat rectangle here, and the only thing between Vantage and a contiguous acquisition was this one house on this one parcel. He looked at the assessed value listed for Nadia's land. The number in the third letter was 22% below the assessed value. Not an offer. A discount applied against the decision they had already made. He put his phone down and sat for a while. The wind was still in the pines. The kitchen was warm. He could hear the small settling sounds of the house the way you can only hear them very late at night when everything else goes quiet. From upstairs, nothing. She was sleeping, or trying to. He thought about the composition books, Gerald's log of repairs, the tools listed and dated, the projects recorded so they would not be lost. The house was full of that kind of record-keeping. A life assembled carefully and maintained carefully and loved without fanfare. It had not protected them from the things that came anyway. The deaths and the silences and the letters from Vantage Holdings with their low numbers and their polished language. Still, it was here. The record of it was here. He picked up the notepad again and wrote, County Commission application, comment period, adjacent landowner objection rights. He had driven 900 miles to tell a woman what her son had said about her in the dark on the other side of the world. He had not planned to stay past 3 days. He had not planned to build anything or investigate anything or get involved in a property dispute in a town he had never heard of before the exit appeared on the highway. Cinder came downstairs at midnight and settled under the kitchen table. Garrett looked at her. I know, he said quietly. He called the county clerk's office when it opened at 8. He asked about the property history of the adjacent parcels and the filing status of any pending applications for use change or commercial variance. The woman on the phone was cautious, but not unhelpful. She told him that a conditional use application had been filed 6 weeks ago for the corridor, pending parcels, contingent on full parcel assembly. Contingent on full parcel assembly, that was the phrase, which meant the application assumed this property would be part of the deal. Has the current owner of this parcel filed anything in relation to the application, he asked. She checked. No, she said. No response on file. He thanked her and hung up. He told Nadia after breakfast. She sat with the information for a moment. She was not a woman who startled easily. So they filed an application that assumed they would get my land, she said. Yes. Before they had it. Yes, her jaw said. That seems wrong. It is wrong, Garrett said. The question is what to do about it. She thought about this. I need to talk to someone who knows about these things, she said. There was a woman named Frances Kohler who ran the Faro Junction Community Development Office out of a 2-room suite above the hardware store. She was 54, with short dark hair threaded with silver, and reading glasses she kept on a beaded chain around her neck, and she had been navigating the bureaucratic architecture of small-town land use for 22 years. When Garrett and Nadia walked in with the 3 letters, she read them all without speaking, and then set them on her desk and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Vantage Holdings, she said. I know who they are. This is the 3rd county. She explained that the company had assembled parcels in 2 other rural counties using the same approach. Letters, low offers, patient pressure, and a contingent application filed before the holdout property was secured, which created procedural momentum that made denial more difficult. It was not illegal. It was designed to feel inevitable. But the application is contingent, Garrett said. If she formally objects to the use change and the parcel is not assembled, the application fails on its own terms. Frances looked at him. You've done your homework. I read the filing. She nodded slowly. A formal written objection from the affected adjacent landowner, filed with the county commission before the public comment period closes, creates a record. The commission can still approve, but they have to respond to the objection in writing. And if the parcel is not assembled, the contingency isn't met. When does the comment period close? Nadia asked. Frances checked something on her computer. 14 days from Monday, she said. Garrett looked at Nadia. Nadia looked at her hands on the desk. What does the objection need to say? She asked Frances. Frances pulled a form from a file drawer. It needs to say you object. You are the affected landowner, and you state your grounds. 1 paragraph is sufficient. A signature and a date. Nadia reached across the desk and took the form. She read it carefully, which she apparently did with everything. Can I write it in longhand? She said. Yes, Frances said. As long as it's legible, you can file it here. I'll timestamp it. Nadia looked at Garrett. There was something in her face that he had not seen there before, which was the particular expression of someone who has been waiting for a door to appear in a wall they had been pressing against for months. "I'll need a pen," she said to Francis. She wrote the objection right there at the desk, 2 paragraphs in the neat, compact cursive of a woman who had spent 40 years corresponding by hand. She stated her name, her property, the application number, and her grounds, which were that she had received no meaningful consultation, that the application assumed an assembly that had not been agreed to, and that she had no intention of selling her home or her land. Francis timestamped it and made a copy and gave Nadia the copy and filed the original. Walking out, Nadia was quiet for most of the block. Then she said, "Danny would have known what to ask." Garrett said nothing. "He was like that," she said. "He read things carefully and asked the right questions." She looked at him sidewise as they walked. "You read things carefully and asked the right questions, too," she said. The man from the white Vantage SUV came to the front door 2 days later. His name was Cliff Arden. He was 44, smooth-faced, in a jacket that was too clean for the weather, carrying a folder that held what he described as a revised and improved offer. He had called ahead, and Nadia had said he could come. And when he arrived, Garrett was sitting in the front room reading a history of the Chosin Reservoir campaign that he had borrowed from a shelf in the hallway, and Cinder was on the rug near the fireplace. Cliff Arden sat down across from Nadia at the dining room table and opened his folder. He was professionally friendly, the kind of friendly that has been practiced until it moves like water, filling every available space. He did not look at Garrett. Cinder looked at Arden the whole time he was talking. Not menacingly, steadily. The revised offer was an increase of $11,000 from the third letter. The language was the same otherwise. He described the opportunity that was coming to this corridor and the difficulty of navigating change without adequate preparation and the wisdom of acting before certain procedural windows closed. He did not mention that the procedural window he was referring to was one that Nadia had just closed herself. "I filed a formal objection with the county commission," Nadia said. Arden stopped. "On what grounds?" he said. The friendliness had not gone exactly, but it had thinned. "I stated them in the objection," she said. "The county has the record." He closed his folder slowly. He glanced at Garrett for the first time. Garrett had not moved. "There are people here," Arden said, meaning Faro Junction, "who would benefit from the development. Jobs, tax revenue. This isn't something that only affects you." "I understand that," Nadia said. "I also understand that you filed an application that assumed you owned my land before I had agreed to sell it. That troubled me." Arden opened his mouth and closed it. He left 20 minutes later without having changed any terms and without having received any promise. He drove down the gravel road in his white SUV, and Cinder stood on the porch and watched him out of sight. There was a follow-up in the form of a letter from the Spokane law firm, formal in its register, which arrived 8 days later and which Nadia brought to Francis Kohler, who read it and said it was an attempt to introduce a timeline pressure that had no legal force. She recommended Nadia not respond directly. Francis also reached out to a land rights organization in the region that monitored consolidation activity by outside holding companies. They sent a staff attorney named Sandra Park, who drove up from Boise on a Thursday and sat in Nadia's kitchen for 2 hours and reviewed all of the correspondence and the county filing and the application itself. Sandra Park was 36, methodical, with the particular kind of careful attention that comes from having seen many variations of the same maneuver. "This is a pattern," she said, which was the same thing Francis had said. And having two people in two professional positions say the same thing about a thing makes it solid in a way that one person cannot. They assemble parcels at below-market rates from owners who don't know they have procedural tools available. The contingent application creates artificial urgency. She looked at Nadia. Your objection was exactly right. It reset the timeline and put a formal record in place. Someone pointed me toward the right questions, Nadia said. Sandra looked at Garrett. I read the filing, he said. The commission public comment period closed on a Thursday. Nadia's was the only formal objection on record. The commission was required to address it before approving any application. Sandra filed a supplemental letter on behalf of the Land Rights Organization 2 days before the deadline, citing the procedural irregularity of filing a contingent application against a parcel whose owner had not consented. The week after the comment period closed, Francis called to say the commission had tabled the application, pending further review. Not denied, tabled, which meant it could come back, and also that the contingency could not be met on the current timeline, and that the company would need to reassemble its approach, and that Nadia had time. Time was enough. Time was, in some cases, the whole thing. Sandra called 2 days after that to say the Land Rights Organization was monitoring the corridor and would be notified of any new filing. She said Nadia did not need to handle it alone, which was said matter-of-factly, the way practical people deliver good news. Nadia thanked her, and when she hung up, she was quiet for a moment. And then she said she had not known 3 weeks ago that any of this machinery existed. Most people don't, Garrett said, until they need it. It helps to have someone who asks the right questions, she said. This was the third time she had said some version of this, and each time she said it, he understood she was not talking only about the county filing. He went back to the workshop in the afternoon. He stood inside it for the first time with the door closed and the light coming through the window he had fitted on the south wall. It was the right size for one person to work in, maybe two, with a long bench along one wall and enough room to stand back from whatever you were building. Gerald had known exactly what he wanted. He found himself thinking about what it would look like with the tools on the wall. He thought about the tools in his truck. He stayed for dinner, and then he stayed for the evening. And after Nadia had gone to bed, he did not sit at the kitchen table with a notepad. He sat in the chair in the front room with the history of Chosin open on his knee and read until he was tired. And then he went upstairs to Danny's room and lay down and was asleep before he had decided to be. Garrett finished the workshop on a Friday morning, 3 weeks after he arrived. He fit the last section of exterior siding and stepped back and looked at it. Gerald had known what he was doing. The bones of the structure had been right all along. It just needed someone to finish it. Nadia came out with 2 mugs of coffee and handed him one. She stood beside him, looking at the building, which was not large but was solid and level and would keep the weather out for a long time. He would have loved this, she said. I know, Garrett said. He didn't explain how he knew. He just meant the sense of it. The plain fact that a man who had started a thing to have a place to build other things would have loved to see it standing. She turned to him. You should stay, she said. Not forever, unless you want, but for a while. He looked at the workshop. He thought about the truck with everything he owned in the bed, the man named Gil in Spokane who owed him a small debt, the job that may or may not have materialized. He thought about Danny talking at 2 in the morning about his mother and a baseball game in the rain and staying for what you came for. He had come to deliver a message. He was not entirely sure the message was finished. "I could help with the fence line," he said. "East side is going." "I noticed that," she said. "And there's a soft spot in the roof of the garage I want to look at before winter gets any worse." "I noticed that too," she said. "I'd need somewhere to sleep." "There's a room," she said. Cinder was sitting between them, her ears forward, her tail moving once, slowly, in the dead grass. She looked from one to the other and then back out at the workshop, satisfied in the way that dogs are when the humans around them have finally arrived at the conclusion the dog reached some time ago. The thing about grief is that it does not end. Sometimes, if you are lucky, or if you are stubborn, or if you drive 900 miles because a question that has been living in your chest for 6 years finally runs out of patience, you find that grief is not the whole story. You find that the people left behind are not only waiting, they are doing, building things, filing objections, writing letters in careful cursive, staying for what they came for. Garrett Mace had driven to Faro Junction to tell a woman that her son had loved her in the particular wordless way of men who carry important things at a distance from their faces. He had not known, driving through the gray expanse of Montana, that he was also driving toward the first place in 2 years that felt like it had room for him. Some distances, the ones that matter, are like that. They look like journeys. They turn out to be arrivals. May you know the people who drive through the dark to find you. May you stay for what you came for. May you build what Gerald started, even when he is not there to see it finished. And may God bless you, keep your family close, and return you always to the places that were waiting.